Good morning and welcome to the next of our daily videos from Yoker Evangelical Church. There are few things worse than being forsaken, than being cut off from somebody and feeling like you're not being heard. And if it's bad being forsaken, it is so much worse to feel forsaken by God. One of our readings this morning was Psalm 22, and Psalm 22 explores exactly that. What does it mean to be forsaken by God? In that famous opening, the psalmist, the person who wrote this, King David, he says these famous lines, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, they are famous partly because of who else said them in the Bible, but we'll come back to that in just a minute. First, I want us to see that these are words written by somebody who knows God. This is not the hopeless cry of the atheist railing against a God that they don't know. This is the cry of somebody who knows God and who loves God, who is able to call him my God, and yet who still says, "Why have you forsaken me?" And as David writes this psalm, it is a real cry for help. David is feeling so many of the emotions that are familiar to us at this time of isolation. As he writes this psalm, David is feeling forsaken. He is feeling unheard, like his prayers aren't being answered. He feels worthless and alone. The overall sense is that he is crying out to God. He is begging for help, and yet he feels like there is no answer coming. And I think a lot of us will be feeling like this during isolation. As we are cut off from each other, as we are unable to meet together, it's really easy for us to feel like we're not being heard. And it can be really easy for us to feel cut off even from God at this time. That as we're not able to meet with other people and encourage each other face to face, it can feel like we are cut off from everyone and everything, including God. That is what David is feeling in this psalm. And if that is you this morning, I want to encourage you to let David guide you through these emotions and to follow his example that he sets out. Because as David talks about his suffering and as he feels isolated, he reminds himself constantly of God's character. And so he doesn't undermine his feelings, and the Bible doesn't do that. It doesn't encourage us to push down what we're feeling, to ignore the emotions that we have, but it encourages us to deal with them in a godly way and in a way that points us back to God. And so just listen to what David does in the first verses of this psalm. He says, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. And yet in his suffering he reminds himself of God's character. At the next words say, yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. David here captures what is for many of us the pattern of Christian life. It is one of suffering, and yet in that suffering reminding ourselves of who God is. And then just as we are reminding ourselves of who God is, we slip up and we look away from him and we end up suffering again before we remind ourselves of who God is. It is a pattern of doing that. Yet we are able to trust in God's promises because his promises stand forever. His words endure. We can trust in him because he has been faithful to his people throughout history, and because he alone says, I change not. This psalm encourages us to follow David's pattern and to turn to God in praise, even as we are feeling at our lowest. This psalm encourages us to look at our emotions, yes, but then remind ourselves of the God who is in charge of everything. And yet we can take a greater comfort from these verses because of who else said these words. These are words that were famously said by Jesus on the cross. In Matthew 27:46, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In quoting this psalm, Jesus shows that David was poetically expressing what he felt. And yet King David was also looking forward to Jesus. This psalm is prophecy of what Jesus would experience on the cross. Jesus experienced the full reality of being forsaken by God, of having God turn his back on him because of sin. Jesus experienced fully what it was to have God turn his back on him so that we would never have to. He took the brunt of that punishment for sin so that while we may feel that God has forsaken us, we can look to the cross of Christ and remind ourselves that he never will. The assurance is that Jesus knew what it was to be forsaken by God, so we would never have to be. And so this psalm encourages us ultimately to turn to Jesus, to remember in the midst of our suffering that we have a great Saviour. This psalm doesn't encourage us to put aside our suffering, far from it. I think David poetically expresses what he is feeling to help us understand our own suffering. But then to follow what he does, to turn that into praise of God, and ultimately to look to Christ, who was forsaken so that we would never have to be. We can take comfort in that this morning and forevermore. May God bless and have a good day.